What law did you break to do the right thing? I was at my grandparents' house when my autistic little brother started writhing on the floor. Ow, ow, ow. His hand was clutching his appendix. Grandma, we need to go hospital. I told your grandfather this would happen, she interrupted. My granddad scoffed. First he has autism, now a little stomach ache is suddenly appendicitis. Our parents were at a work conference, so I tried to prove to my grandparents it was serious by asking Jamie to point to where it hurts. When he jabbed his lower right side, I explained my science teacher taught us this. Stop showing off. Grandma's voice dripped with disgust. Little Miss Know-It-All, Jamie whimpered, clutching harder. He stood up to leave the table, and suddenly Grandma's hands clamped down on his shoulders. You can call it what you want, but in my day this was called being a brat. I was just about to help Jamie do his breathing exercises when he started violently erupting in vomit. Jamie must have puked for almost a minute straight. Yellow, green, and red, blood, all over Grandma's good tablecloth. See? Look what he's done to my precious tablecloth. This is what happens when you coddle them. An unbearable wave of terror shot through me. Jamie never pukes during meltdowns, ever. Grandpa, please stop looking at your freaking newspaper. He's really sick. He finally looked up. Enough. Sit down or I'll give you something to really cry about. My parents would have already been halfway to the hospital. Before I could respond, they hauled Jamie to his feet. Grandma held him vertical while Jamie's little hands clawed at his side, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Walk. Prove you're faking. Every muscle in his tiny body was shaking. Stop the dramatics. These are literally all the appendicitis symptoms. What do you know? You're 12. Grandma examined her nails, teaching him to be weak, just like your parents. I rushed to Jamie while they bickered about discipline. My hand touched his forehead and I jerked back. His skin was hot. His eyes rolled back. We were losing him. I lunged for the phone, but Grandpa was faster. Beep. We're the adults here, he said before unplugging it from the wall. Jamie crawled toward the bathroom like a worm on a hot pavement, one hand clutching his side, the other pulling his body forward. I sat frozen in place, too scared to move. Grandpa stepped over him to lock the bathroom door. Corner, now, until you learn to behave. I tried to convince myself that maybe he really was faking, that everything would be okay, but that's when I saw it. Silent tears. Jamie only cries silently when he's in physical pain. I couldn't take it anymore. For goodness sake, he's dying. Right in front of you and you don't even care. Grandma rolled her eyes. Drama runs in your family. Granddad cranked up the TV volume. Anything to drown out the sound of his helpless grandson losing his life. Enough. I spotted Grandpa's car keys on the counter. They were both too busy arguing about kids these days to see me grabbing them. As soon as I made my way out the back door, I mashed the car key buttons as fast as I could. It only took a few seconds before the car alarm went off. Beep, 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 beep. I pressed again. Beep, beep, beep. I didn't even care that our city had strict noise laws. I just dove behind the car and kept pressing. Mrs. Lee came out first, then Mr. Park, then the Pilsners. Grandpa burst through the back door. What the hell is going on? Beep, beep, beep. My brother is dying, I screamed over the alarm. They won't call 911. He has appendicitis. Mrs. Lee, the retired nurse, didn't hesitate. She pushed past my useless grandfather. More neighbors followed. I kept hitting that car alarm like my life depended on it, because Jamie's dead. Mrs. Lee took one look at Jamie and called 911 herself. Then came the sirens. Finally, 2 EMTs rushed in with a stretcher. The female EMT dropped beside Jamie, her hands moving fast. Jamie didn't even flinch. That's how far gone he was. How long has he been like this? She was already getting an oxygen mask ready. My grandparents wouldn't, I started. Possible rupture, she called to her partner. We're going hot. They moved like lightning. He looked so small, so still. Is he? I couldn't finish my sentence. The EMT's eyes met mine as they wheeled him out. We need to move. Now. Grandpa was still insisting we were overreacting as they loaded Jamie into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. Sirens screaming, racing against time. His appendix burst during surgery. But what happened next would haunt our family forever. The ambulance tore off with its sirens wailing, and I just stood there watching it disappear around the corner. Mrs. Lee grabbed my arm and steered me toward her car while telling me we were following right behind them. The whole ride there, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept seeing Jamie's face when they loaded him onto that stretcher. At the hospital, Mrs. Lee dropped me at the emergency entrance and told me she'd park and find me inside. The automatic doors whooshed open and the smell of disinfectant hit me like a wall. A nurse at the desk looked up and asked if I was with a boy who just came in by ambulance. I nodded and she walked me to this plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room and told me to sit tight. She said they'd taken Jamie straight back to trauma and someone would update me soon. I watched nurses rushing past with carts and equipment and my stomach twisted tighter with each passing second. About 10 minutes later, another nurse came over with a clipboard asking about insurance and consent forms. I panicked and told her my grandparents were his guardians today, but they weren't here yet. She frowned and asked where they were, and I explained everything about them refusing to call 911. Her face changed completely, and she said something about implied consent in emergencies when guardians fail to act. She wrote something down and said they didn't need anyone's permission to save Jamie's life. Relief washed over me, but then this sick dread settled in my chest about what would happen when my grandparents showed up. 20 minutes passed before a woman in scrubs came out asking for Jamie's family. I jumped up and she introduced herself as the pediatric surgeon who'd be operating on him. She sat me down and explained Jamie's appendix had likely already ruptured based on his symptoms and lab work. She said he was going septic, which meant the infection was spreading through his body. The risks of waiting too long included organ failure and worse things she didn't want to spell out for me. My throat closed up thinking about how I just sat there frozen at the table while he was dying on the floor. She squeezed my shoulder and said they were prepping him for emergency surgery right now. Then she was gone and I was alone again in that stupid plastic chair. The waiting room clock ticked so loud I thought my head would explode. 45 minutes later, Grandpa burst through the emergency room doors already already yelling about dramatics and overreactions. He spotted me and started ranting about how we'd disrupted the whole neighborhood for nothing. I counted the ceiling tiles over and over to keep from screaming at him. There were 64 tiles on the ceiling and 12 fluorescent lights, and I memorized every water stain and crack. He kept going on about how Jamie was just attention-seeking, and this whole thing was ridiculous. My whole body went numb because it was the only way I could sit there without losing it completely. After what felt like forever, I remembered the hospital phone on the wall and asked the desk nurse if I could use it. She nodded and I dialed Mom's cell with shaking fingers. Mom answered on the second ring, and when I told her where we were, she started crying immediately. Dad's voice came on speaker, and it was shaking as he asked what happened. I explained everything from Jamie's pain to the vomiting blood to Grandpa unplugging the phone. Mom was sobbing, and Dad kept saying they were still 3 hours away from their conference. I promised I'd stay with Jamie and call them the second I knew anything about the surgery. The surgeon finally came back out 2 hours after she'd taken him in. She looked tired but not devastated, which gave me a tiny bit of hope. She confirmed Jamie's appendix had ruptured and peritonitis had set in, which is when infection spreads through the abdomen. They'd cleaned out as much infected tissue as they could and put in drainage tubes. He was heading to the pediatric ICU with heavy antibiotics pumping through his system. She said he'd survive, but recovery would take weeks instead of the few days it would have been with a simple appendectomy. The words hung in the air as she explained that the delay had definitely made everything worse. If we'd gotten him here even 2 hours earlier, there would have been fewer complications. Those words, "if earlier," kept echoing in my head, mixing guilt with this burning fury at my grandparents. Grandpa actually scoffed and said we were being dramatic about a routine surgery. The surgeon's eyes went cold, and she said a ruptured appendix in a child was never routine. My parents finally burst through the doors around 11 that night, both pale and shaking. Mom went straight to the ICU to see Jamie, while Dad stayed to deal with Grandpa and Grandma, who'd shown up an hour earlier. The confrontation was immediate, with Dad trying to keep his voice down while demanding to know why the phone was unplugged. Grandma kept insisting Jamie was being dramatic, but Mom came back from the ICU and completely lost it. She didn't hold back about their neglect and how they could have killed him with their ignorance. I finally felt validated that someone else saw how wrong this whole thing was. The next morning, Mrs. Lee stopped by with coffee for Mom and a juice for me. She quietly mentioned she'd written down everything she saw and heard at the house. Something is unsettling about how the grandparents keep doubling down, even when Jamie's clearly suffering. I wonder if they're scared to admit they were wrong, or if they genuinely can't see what's happening right in front of them. She said she'd give a statement to whoever needed it about Jamie's condition, and my grandparents' refusal to get help. That thin thread of support meant everything, knowing someone else had witnessed what happened. Later that morning, a woman in a suit pulled my parents aside in the hallway. I could see them talking, and Mom's face went white while Dad's jaw clenched tighter and tighter. When they came back, Mom explained the hospital administrator said they were required to file a report with Child Protective Services. The hospital had to report medical neglect when guardians refused necessary emergency care. My stomach dropped because now the government was involved, and I didn't know if that made things better or worse. The next morning, a nurse finally came to get me and led me through double doors into the ICU. Jamie looked so tiny in that huge hospital bed with tubes coming out of everywhere. A machine beeped every few seconds while another one made this whooshing sound. His face was pale and his eyes were closed, but I could see his chest moving up and down. The oxygen mask covered most of his face and made this weird hissing noise. I pulled a chair close to his bed and started talking about his favorite video game. I told him about the new level I'd beaten and how the boss monster had this cool attack pattern. His eyes fluttered open for just a second, and I kept talking about power-ups and secret areas. The nurse showed me how to hold his hand without pulling on the IV line. She said talking to him was good even if he couldn't answer back. I stayed there for maybe an hour, just describing game strategies and character builds. When I came back out to the waiting room, Grandpa was at the nurse's station. He was telling the nurse that Jamie just had a tantrum and we were all making a big deal out of nothing. The nurse kept her face totally blank while he talked, but I saw her write something down. She nodded and said she'd make a note in the chart. Grandpa kept going about how kids these days are coddled too much. The nurse just kept writing and nodding without saying much back. When he finally walked away, she looked at me for a second, then went back to her computer. Mom and Dad were having this quiet fight in the hallway near the vending machines. Dad kept saying maybe his parents just didn't understand how serious autism makes things. Mom shot him this look that could kill and said understanding wasn't the issue. Dad said we needed to think about family unity during this difficult time. Mom's jaw got tight and she turned away from him. I could tell she wanted to say more, but other people were walking by. Dad put his hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. 2 days later, this guy in a suit showed up with a thick folder. He introduced himself as Jesse Willis from Child Protective Services. He explained they had to investigate when hospitals report medical neglect. He said he needed to interview each of us separately about what happened. My stomach felt like it had rocks in it. Jesse took me to this small room with plastic chairs and a fake plant in the corner. He asked me to tell him everything that happened from the beginning. I explained about Jamie's pain and the vomiting and how my grandparents wouldn't listen. Then I admitted that I froze at first before thinking of the car alarm. I asked if that made it partly my fault that Jamie got so sick. Jesse looked right at me and said I saved my brother's life. He said 12-year-olds shouldn't have to make those kinds of decisions. That's when I started crying for the first time since everything happened. He handed me a tissue box and waited while I got myself together. After my interview, I could hear Mom talking to Jesse through the door. She was explaining how they had to travel for work conferences sometimes. She said they'd always relied on her in-laws for childcare during those trips. Her voice got shaky when she said they had no idea it was this bad. I realized they were scared about who would watch us now. The surgeon came by that afternoon with a clipboard full of papers. His name tag said Hugh Waller, and he looked really serious. He explained that Jamie's appendix had been close to bursting for hours before surgery. He showed us charts about infection markers and white blood cell counts. Jamie would need IV antibiotics for at least 2 weeks. There might be more procedures if the infection didn't clear up right. We were looking at weeks in the hospital and months of recovery at home, all because of those few hours of delay while my grandparents argued about discipline. Jesse came back the next day with more paperwork. He outlined something called a temporary safety plan while the investigation continued. My grandparents couldn't have any unsupervised contact with me or Jamie. They could visit, but only if our parents were there the whole time. Part of me felt relief, but mostly I felt this heavy dread. This was going to tear our family apart even more than it already was. That night, I was getting a soda from the vending machine when I heard shouting from the parking garage. I followed the sound and saw Grandpa had Dad backed against a concrete pillar. Grandpa was yelling about betrayal and how we'd turned the government against them. He said if this was how we treated family, then we were on our own. Dad kept trying to calm him down, but wasn't really defending us either. Grandpa said they were cutting us off completely, and we'd regret this. Dad just stood there taking it without pushing back the way he should have. I started losing trust in him right then. 3 days after surgery, Jamie's temperature shot up to 104 degrees. The nurses rushed in and started packing ice around him. Hugh came running with another doctor, and they did an ultrasound right there in the room. They found an abscess where infected fluid had collected. Jamie needed another procedure to drain it. I heard Hugh telling Mom about something called peritonitis. That's when infection spreads through your whole belly. I spent that night on my phone Googling survival rates for ruptured appendix with peritonitis. The numbers made me want to throw up. Jesse came to our house 3 days after Jamie got moved to a regular room. He had a clipboard and kept checking boxes while asking Mom about what happened. Mom asked him about pressing charges against my grandparents, but Jesse shook his head and explained CPS only handles the civil side. He gave her a card for the police department and said they'd need to file a separate report there if they wanted criminal charges. I watched Dad's jaw tighten as Jesse explained how the systems don't really talk to each other and we'd basically have to tell the whole story again to different people. Mom made the call right there and they said Detective Franklin York would come by tomorrow. The detective showed up exactly at 10 the next morning with a recorder and notebook. He listened to everything, wrote down dates and times, then leaned back in his chair. He told us prosecuting grandparents in these cases almost never happens unless there's broken bones or worse. The system doesn't really see emotional abuse or medical neglect the same way. I wasn't surprised, but it still made my stomach hurt, knowing they could just get away with almost killing Jamie. School started again the following Monday, and I kept my head down walking through the halls. During lunch, some kid I didn't even know walked past and said something about me being the ambulance kid who called the cops on her own family. Word spreads fast in our town. I stopped eating in the cafeteria after that and started spending lunch in the library. The librarian didn't ask questions when I sat in the back corner with a book I wasn't really reading. I stopped talking to anyone except when teachers called on me directly. Even then, I only gave the shortest answers possible. Wednesday in gym class, I couldn't focus on the basketball drills and kept missing easy shots. The teacher pulled me aside and told me I needed to toughen up, that kids today are too soft and can't handle a little family drama. His words sounded exactly like something Grandma would say, and I realized I couldn't trust just anyone with what really happened. Some adults think kids should just deal with whatever their family does to them. That evening, Mom asked me to write down everything I remembered for Jesse's investigation. I sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours writing every single detail. The unplugged phone, the locked bathroom door, which neighbors came out when I set off the car alarm, who said what and when. Having it all written down made me feel like I had some control over the chaos, like there was proof it really happened the way I remembered. I made 2 copies just in case. Mrs. Lee came over the next afternoon with her own typed statement about Jamie's condition when she found him. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring, and her medical observations carried weight. She described his fever, his rigid abdomen, the signs of shock she recognized. Having an adult, especially one with medical training, confirm what I saw helped more than I expected. It wasn't just a kid overreacting. It was real. Mr. Park stopped by later that week to talk to Jesse during a follow-up visit. He wanted to help, but had to admit he didn't actually see inside the house before the ambulance came. He only heard the car alarm and saw the commotion after. Jesse thanked him, but I could tell it wouldn't be useful for the case. Good intentions don't count for much when you need actual witnesses. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, but things weren't the same. He started having nightmares every single night, waking up crying and grabbing at his stomach. All his old coping skills that we'd worked on for years seemed to disappear. He needed his weighted blanket again, his noise machine, the exact same bedtime routine we'd used when he was 5. This whole situation with Jesse from CPS makes me wonder what's really going through everyone's minds here, especially with Dad trying to keep peace while Mom's clearly done with his parents. The way that nurse just kept writing while Grandpa ranted about coddled kids. I adjusted my whole schedule to help him feel safe. I'd sit with him until he fell asleep, then check on him every hour. I became more protective than ever, watching for any sign he was in pain or distress. The therapy referral Jesse gave us turned out to be basically useless. When Mom called, they said the first available appointment was 6 weeks out, and that was just for an initial consultation. The actual therapy wouldn't start for another month after that. I felt this heavy frustration settling in my chest. Even when you try to get help, there are so many barriers and waiting lists and paperwork. Everything takes forever when you need it right now. Saturday afternoon, I was doing homework in the dining room when I heard Dad on the phone in his office. The door was cracked and his voice carried. He was talking to Grandpa, offering to pay them money if everyone could just move forward from this whole situation. He actually used those words, move forward, like Jamie almost dying was just some little disagreement we should get over. He mentioned something about keeping the family together and not letting this destroy relationships. My chest felt hollow listening to him prioritize his parents over what they did to Jamie. I wondered if he'd ever really choose us over them, or if we'd always come second to keeping his parents happy. The investigation meetings kept happening every few days with Jesse taking notes and asking follow-up questions, but nothing seemed to actually change. Jesse showed up at our house 2 weeks later with a folder thick with papers and said we needed to have a family meeting about next steps. He pulled out this typed agenda with bullet points about safety safety protocols and contact boundaries and expectations moving forward, while I watched my parents' faces get tighter with each item he listed. Mom made coffee, and Dad kept checking his phone for work emails, and I just sat there wondering how bad this meeting was going to get. Jesse said everyone needed to stay calm and stick to facts, not emotions, which seemed impossible given what we were talking about. My grandparents arrived 15 minutes late, and Grandma walked in complaining about the traffic and how we should have scheduled this for a better time. She sat down and immediately started talking about how Jamie just needs more structure and discipline, not all this coddling we do. You let him get away with too much because of his autism, she said while straightening her purse strap. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I forced myself to stay calm and just kept repeating the medical facts about Jamie's burst appendix and the surgery and the infection that almost killed him. Grandpa sat there silent, reading something on his phone like this was just another boring meeting he had to sit through. Jesse cleared his throat and explained that the investigation was leaning toward a finding of indicated neglect based on the medical evidence and witness statements. He said if any contact happened going forward, it would need to be through supervised visitation at an approved facility with a social worker present. The whole room went quiet after that, everyone understanding that our family would never be the same again. 6 weeks later, I woke up to Jamie crying in his bed, his hand pressed against his stomach where the surgery scar was. Mom checked his temperature and it was 102, and when she pressed gently on his belly, he screamed so loud it woke up the whole house. The emergency room doctor took one look at him and ordered a CT scan that showed an abscess had formed where his appendix used to be. They admitted him immediately for IV antibiotics and told us he'd need another procedure to drain the infection. I sat in that same waiting room chair feeling tired in a way that went deeper than just being sleepy, the fear still there but dulled by how many times we'd been through this now. Dad had to leave for work because he'd already missed so many days, and Mom stayed with Jamie while I went to the school and pretended everything was normal. 2 days later, Dad showed me an email from his manager about his attendance issues and the possibility of disciplinary action if he missed more time. Mom had already used up all her sick days and was taking unpaid leave, which meant the bills were piling up on the kitchen counter. The stress was showing in how they snapped at each other over small things like who forgot to buy milk or whose turn it was to do laundry. My best friend had been weird at the school for weeks, not sitting with me at lunch and taking forever to text back when she used to reply right away. She finally admitted her mom thought our family had too much drama and maybe we needed some space until things calmed down. I stopped texting her after that and ate lunch in the library where no one would ask me questions about why I was alone. The other kids whispered when they thought I couldn't hear, talking about the ambulance at the school and my crazy grandparents and how messed up my family was. 7 weeks after Jesse first mentioned it, we finally got the call that our psychology intake appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The receptionist emailed a packet of forms that needed to be filled out beforehand, pages and pages asking about trauma history and symptoms and family dynamics. I sat at the kitchen table with Mom going through each question, trying to explain things that didn't fit into neat checkbox categories. Part of me felt hopeful that maybe someone could actually help us figure out how to move forward, but mostly I just felt tired of telling our story over and over. Jesse called the next week with the official CPS finding, which was indicated neglect against my grandparents, but no criminal charges would be filed. He explained this meant it was documented and would stay on their record, but they wouldn't face jail time or have to go to court. It felt like validation that we weren't crazy or overdramatic, but also bitter knowing they wouldn't face any real consequences for what they did to Jamie. 3 months passed before we heard from them again, a holiday card arriving in early December with a Bible verse about forgiveness printed on the front. Inside, Grandma had written in her perfect cursive about how important it is to respect your elders and not let misunderstandings destroy family bonds. I felt angry reading it, but also relieved because now we had proof in writing of how they still didn't understand or take responsibility for what happened. My parents had long discussions about what to do, finally deciding that if my grandparents wanted any contact, it would have to be at a supervised visitation center downtown with a trained social worker watching everything. They gave me the choice of whether I wanted to participate, and for the first time in my life, I said no to something involving family. I was done pretending things were okay when they weren't, done putting myself in situations that made me feel unsafe just to keep the peace. That night, I opened my laptop and started typing everything that happened, changing names and keeping details vague enough that nobody could identify us. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard, getting it all out like poison from a wound. I posted it on a support forum for people with toxic families and watched the comments roll in. Some people understood completely and shared their own horror stories about grandparents who refused to believe medical emergencies. Others told me I should respect my elders no matter what, that family is family, that I was being dramatic. Reading those made my stomach hurt, but the supportive ones helped more. People sent me resources about medical neglect and emergency custody, and one person even offered to help pay for Jamie's medical bills. I didn't take the money, but knowing strangers cared more than our own grandparents meant something. 3 weeks later, we were back at the hospital for Jamie's follow-up, and the nurse smiled when she saw us. She unwrapped the bandages around his arm where the PICC line had been pumping antibiotics into him for months. Jamie watched her work with those big eyes of his, not making a sound even though I knew it hurt. When she pulled the line out, he barely flinched, but I saw his shoulders relax like a weight had been lifted. The doctor came in and checked his scar, pressing gently on his belly while Jamie stayed perfectly still. Everything looked good, healing well, no signs of infection, but when we walked past the emergency room on our way out, Jamie grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. The smell of disinfectant made him walk faster, and I knew that smell would probably bother him forever. 2 months after that, we all sat in a conference room at the courthouse while lawyers talked about grandparent visitation rights. Mom and Dad sat on one side of the table, my grandparents on the other with their lawyer. The mediator kept using words like compromise and reasonable accommodation and best interests of the child. I sat there feeling nothing, just watching the clock and counting the ceiling tiles. My grandparents' lawyer talked about their rights as grandparents, about maintaining family bonds, about how they'd raise Dad just fine. Our lawyer brought up the medical neglect, the refusal to call 911, the fact that Jamie almost died. Back and forth they went for 2 hours while I sat there knowing this was just another thing we had to get through. The mediator finally suggested supervised visits at a neutral location with a social worker present. My grandparents would have to acknowledge what happened and complete a course on recognizing medical emergencies in children. Grandma's face turned red when she heard that. Grandpa slammed his hand on the table. Their lawyer whispered to them for a long time. Then they said no. They wouldn't admit to doing anything wrong, wouldn't take any classes, wouldn't accept supervision. If they couldn't see us on their terms, they didn't want to see us at all. Why would Dad offer to pay his parents money to move forward when Jamie nearly died from their choices? That conversation through the cracked door raises so many questions about where his priorities really lie. Mom cried in the car afterward, but I just felt empty. Dad started spending more time in the garage after that, working on projects that never seemed to get finished. I'd find empty beer bottles in the recycling bin, more and more each week. Sometimes he'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, staring at nothing, a half-empty bottle in front of him. He never talked about his parents, but I could see it eating at him. Part of me felt bad for him, even though he should have protected us from the start. But mostly I just watched and made sure Jamie stayed out of his way on the bad nights. I started making my own plans to keep us safe. I bought a portable phone charger with my allowance money and kept my phone at 100% all the time. I wrote Mrs. Lee's number on a card and stuck it to the fridge with a magnet. I made copies of our house key and hid them by the front door, back door, and in the garage. Mom asked why I was doing all this, and I told her I just wanted to be prepared. She hugged me and said I shouldn't have to worry about these things, but we both knew that ship had sailed. I practiced dialing 911 with my eyes closed, memorized the closest urgent care locations, kept a first aid kit in my backpack. 5 months after everything happened, I sat in Jamie's room watching him sleep. The house was quiet, except for the furnace clicking on and off. His pajama top had ridden up, and I could see the thin white scar on his belly, barely visible now unless you knew where to look. He was breathing steady and calm, one hand tucked under his pillow, the other holding his favorite stuffed dinosaur. No more IV lines, no more hospital visits every week, no more waking up screaming from nightmares about being back at Grandma's house. I pulled his blanket up to his chin and sat back in the chair I'd dragged in from my room. This was my new normal, checking on him at night, making sure he was okay, being ready for anything. We never got an apology from my grandparents, never got them to admit they almost killed him, never got any kind of justice really. Just distance from people who chose their pride over my brother's life, and a bunch of safety plans that might not ever be needed, but made me feel better having them. It wasn't enough, but it had to be. Thanks for hanging out with me while I wondered about all this stuff today, even if some of the answers stayed just out of reach. I'll catch you next time. Like the video. It helps more than you think.